As a man hovered at the edge of life, a forgotten song rose from the shadows of memory, and a woman became the final hope of bringing peace to a family once feared across Pennsylvania. Tell us in the comments where you are listening from. The intensive care unit at St. Mary Hospital was steeped in the sterile scent of antiseptic and the quiet ache of despair. Michael Delaney stood by the window with his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the town lights dissolving beneath the heavy October fog. Behind him, the steady beeping of the monitors was the only sign that the heart of James Delaney, a man who had once been a pillar of a small community in eastern Pennsylvania, was still fighting. His 78-year-old father lay motionless on the hospital bed, the once rugged lines of his face now pale and taut, as if he were wrestling with something deep within his mind, something no one on the outside could ever understand. Ellen Delaney sat beside him, her fingers wrapped around her husband's hand, holding on gently yet helplessly, as though she could somehow pass to him whatever strength he had left. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, her once gentle face carved with exhaustion and sorrow, her eyes swollen and red from countless sleepless nights. James had been the backbone, the unshakable one, the man the family leaned on for nearly 5 decades. Now he was only a frail body, lips trembling without sound, as though calling back a memory only he could hear. Michael did not turn around. His reflection in the glass showed a man in his early 40s with a calm face, a firm jaw, and a flawlessly pressed gray suit that radiated the detached control of a successful New York attorney. Yet in his eyes lay a quiet helplessness, a storm held back behind layers of discipline he had learned from the very father now fading behind him. "He is not at peace," Ellen whispered, her voice raw. "James was never like this. Not even overseas during the war, not even. When your grandmother passed, he was always steady. But now?" She faltered. "He seems frightened of something. He cannot find his way to rest." Michael tightened his fists. He did not believe in spirits. He believed in science and medicine and numbers glowing on a screen. But his mother was not someone who misunderstood easily. Ellen Delaney had sharp instincts, and there was something in her voice that unsettled him. Dr. Harrison entered, a man in his early 50s with the calm expression of someone who had witnessed too many final moments. He checked the monitors and shook his head. "We administered morphine, a low dose. It is not helping much. He may be experiencing delirium from neurological decline. Near the end, it happens often." Ellen looked up. "No, this is not delirium. He is trying to remember something. Trying to say something. But none of us can understand it." Michael turned then, his gaze landing on his father. James's eyes remained closed, but his lips moved, repeating, something soundless. Ellen grasped her son's hand. "Do you hear it?" Michael held his breath. Then he did hear it. Not clearly, only broken syllables, fragile and trembling like scraps of melody rising from a distant place. He was not speaking, he was singing. That rhythm, there was something familiar in it. Ellen began to cry. "It is that old song. He used to sing it while gardening, when he carried you as a baby, when he missed your grandmother. But he never told me the name, never taught it to me. He only sang it alone. And now," she looked at her son with pleading eyes. "Michael, we have to find that song. Maybe it is the only way to help him find peace." Michael swallowed hard. He had no idea what to do. For the first time in his life he felt fear. Not fear of death itself, but of watching the strongest man he had ever known trembling and lost, drifting into a place none of them could reach. Where are you listening to this story from? Let us know in the comments. Each place you share helps us feel how far these stories travel and whose hearts they touch along the way. And if this story makes you pause for a moment, makes you think of someone you love, or simply makes you feel something quiet and real, do not hesitate to subscribe, like, and share this video with someone who may need to hear a story like this. We will continue bringing heartfelt storytelling, filled with life's breath and gentle but profound messages every day. Tell us the state you are in, the city you are listening from, or even the quiet corner of your day where this story finds you. Your presence is the reason we keep writing each new chapter. Michael remained there in silence, eyes fixed on his father's trembling lips. Those faint sounds felt like an old tune rising from the deepest chambers of memory, yet slipping away as easily as morning fog. Ellen wiped her tears and held James's hand tighter, as if afraid that letting go meant losing him entirely. She spoke softly but firmly. It is a folk song. I believe it is. It sounds like the melodies he used to hum when you were children, while clearing the yard, fixing the car in the garage. Not often, just once in a while, as if reminding himself of something. Michael shook his head. Just a fragment of memory. Nothing more. Near the end, the brain fires at random. Old memories get triggered. He does not need music. He needs medication. Ellen turned toward him, her eyes filled with hurt and disappointment. You always think everything can be explained with logic. But there are things beyond your understanding. Your father is not weak. If he is trying to sing, it is not an accident. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but footsteps clicked behind him. Laura appeared at the doorway, her coat draped over her arm, her forehead damp with sweat from rushing in from the parking lot. Mom called me. I came as fast as I could. She kissed Ellen's cheek and glanced at Michael. Are you all right? Michael nodded but said, nothing. Laura approached the bed, her dark eyes shimmering. She sat beside their mother and took James's other hand. After a moment she whispered, more to herself than anyone. That song. What is it? I remember him humming it once. It sounded like a blend of country and hymn. Ellen nodded. I thought so too. But he only ever sang a few lines, as though he never wanted anyone to know the whole thing. Laura frowned and thought, if he is trying to sing again, maybe it is his way of reaching for something he lost. A person, a place, a memory. Michael sighed. So you are going to suggest we call a medium, is that it? Laura ignored the sarcasm. No. But I know people who do music therapy. They help patients through song. I once worked with a nursing home in Queens. There was a young woman there, a music therapist, incredibly gifted. I saw an Alzheimer's patient remember her own child's name after just a few notes the therapist sang. Ellen blinked. You think she could help? It is worth trying. If that song is real, if it means something to him, she might be able to find it or at least sing something close enough to calm him. Michael folded his arms. That is speculation. We do not know the title. We do not know the lyrics. There is no recording, and he has not sung it in decades. Laura turned to him, her gaze steady. And we have nothing to lose. Her words froze the room. Ellen looked to Michael with quiet hope. James lay there, chest rising softly with each breath of the machine, lips forming those fragile notes again and again. Michael looked at his father, then at his mother and sister. Finally, he gave a small nod. Find her, but make it clear I am not promising anything. This is not a miracle. We are just trying to make his last days easier, not chasing fantasies. Laura smiled gently. I am not looking for a miracle. I am looking for music. Then she squeezed her father's hand and whispered, I will find that song for you. I promise. In the corner of the room, dim light cast soft reflections along the white wall, shaping the silhouettes of the three of them standing together beside the bed, as if the whole family were holding on to one another at the fragile threshold between life and memory. And somewhere beyond the glass and the October night, the unnamed notes of a forgotten melody waited quietly to be called home. 3 days later, Laura returned to St. Augustine, a modest nursing home on the edge of Queens where she had volunteered a few years before. She had not planned to come here today. In fact, she had only meant to stop by a medical supply store to ask about a reclining chair for her mother, but somehow her feet had carried her to this place, as if something were calling her back. The air was cold in the early days of October, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and strong black coffee, the kind of smells that had once made her feel at ease. Laura stepped into the main lobby where a small group of elderly residents had gathered around an old piano. A few nurses stood nearby, and some family members sat quietly beside their loved ones, nodding gently in time with the music. There was always a particular kind of peace in this place, the kind of peace that belonged to somewhere people did not come to be healed, but to wait with a certain softness. She was about to turn away when a voice rose up, a clear, pure sound that was not unfamiliar, drifting from a quiet corner of the room. It did not come from the person playing the piano. It came from a young woman standing next to an armchair where a frail older man was dozing. The young woman, with light brown hair falling loosely to her shoulders, wore a soft gray sweater and a small checkered scarf, and she was singing something. Slowly, gently, like wind moving across a field, each note flowed out as evenly as a breath. But what made Laura freeze was not the voice. It was the melody. That melody. It was the one. Even without words, even with the tempo, slightly slower and the phrasing a little different. The first few notes made her heart tighten as if a hand had closed around it. It was her father's song. The song he used to hum on late afternoons while fixing the old Chevrolet. The song that lingered in the air when Ellen stood in the kitchen and Michael played alone with his wooden train set. Laura did not remember a title. In truth, the song might never have had a name, but she remembered the way it felt. Like standing inside a small wooden house in the hills, with the last light of day pouring through the window and the warmth of a father she had once believed could never be broken. Laura slowed her steps, her eyes never leaving the woman who was singing. The young woman did not see her. She kept her focus on the old man in the chair, her hands resting lightly on his wrist, as if she were using both her voice and her presence to hold him here a little longer. When the song ended, Laura stood rooted to the spot. Her throat felt tight, as though something buried for many years had just been stirred awake. She was not yet ready to speak, but she could not walk away. She waited until the young woman closed a small notebook, pulled out her phone, and left the room toward the back hall. Laura followed, her heart pounding. She did not know what she would say, only that she could not let this moment slip past. When they both stopped near the small staff tea room, Laura spoke first. "Excuse me, I just heard you singing." The young woman turned, slightly startled, but her smile came quickly. "Oh, I am sorry if I disturbed you." "No," Laura said quickly, shaking her head. "Not at all. Your voice is beautiful. But what stopped me was not your voice. It was the song. Where did you learn it?" The young woman tilted her head, frowning just a little. "It is an old folk tune," she said. "My grandmother used to sing it when I was little. It does not really have an official title, at least I have never seen it, written down anywhere, but I always remembered the melody." Laura felt a chill move down her spine. She swallowed. "Where was your grandmother from?" "Tennessee," the young woman answered. "Rural area near Johnson City. Of course, that was exactly where James Delaney had been stationed as a young man, the place he always described as the first place he had learned how to slow down and breathe." Laura nodded slowly, her heart thudding faster. "What is your name?" "Emily," she said. "Emily Carter." For a few seconds, Laura could not breathe. Everything was beginning to line up in ways that felt too precise to dismiss. She forced herself to stay calm. "My name is Laura Delaney," she said. Emily waited politely, her head slightly tilted. And Laura whispered, "I think you just sang the song that might bring peace to my father, and I need your help." Less than an hour after that brief encounter, Laura called Michael. Her voice trembled slightly over the phone, but it was steady with resolve. "You need to. Come. Right now. I know it sounds crazy, but I found the song. Not a recording, not something on the radio. A real person. She is singing our father's song." Michael stood outside his law office in Manhattan, phone pressed to his ear as he stared absently at the rush of traffic. He did not believe in predestined coincidences. But his sister did not sound like someone talking about faith. She sounded like someone talking about a chance. One last chance. "Address," he said. When he arrived at St. Augustine, Michael walked down a hallway lined with crooked oil paintings faded by time, while the sound of a cooking show drifted from a television in an open room. He did not know what he expected, but crossing that threshold made him feel as though he were stepping into something too intimate, too charged with feeling, the very thing he disliked most. Laura was waiting near the nurse's station, her eyes still shining with that same bright intensity she had as a child whenever she discovered something that made the world inside her come alive. She hurried to him, grabbed his hand, and pulled him along without pausing to explain. "She is in the music room on the second floor," Laura said. "They have a little corner set aside for patients who need therapy through music. She came in late today, but I convinced her to stay just a bit longer. I talked to her already, but what?" Michael cut in. "She is cautious," Laura answered softly. "Very polite, but clearly not eager to get involved in anything that feels vague. You will have to convince her." Michael raised an eyebrow but kept his thoughts to himself. When they reached the door, Laura stopped. "You should go in alone," she said quietly. "I think this should be between the two of you." He stepped inside. The room was small, holding only a cushioned chair and an acoustic guitar resting in the corner. Emily stood by the window, packing her bag. She looked up as he entered, her gray-blue eyes neither surprised nor wary, simply waiting for an explanation. Michael studied her for a few seconds. The woman in front of him was nothing like the image he had formed in his mind. She was not a therapist in a white coat, and she did not look like a dreamy artist either. She wore simple clothes, jeans, and a checkered shirt, her brown hair tied loosely to one side, her face bare of makeup. Yet there was something in the way she stood, in the way she looked at him, that told him she had lived long enough with other people's pain that it no longer unsettled her. "I am Michael Delaney," he said, his voice low and firm. "Laura's brother." "I guessed," Emily replied gently. "She told me about the song," Michael went on, "and about my father." "I am not sure the song has anything to do with him," she said. "You sang it today," he replied, "and it matches a tune my father used to hum when I was a boy." Emily did not argue, but she did not agree either. "The song does not have a name," she said quietly. "I learned it from my grandmother. It is an old melody from the South. Nobody truly knows where it came from, but you remember it," he said. "I do," she answered, "because it makes me feel like I am home." Her answer took him off guard. He had not expected that kind of plain-spoken honesty. He moved a step farther into the room. "My father is dying," Michael said, "and it seems that song is the last thing he is trying to hold on to. I do not believe feelings can heal anything, but if it could help him find a little peace at the end." "You want me to come and sing?" Emily said, with a simple directness. "Just once," Michael nodded. "No one else knows it. No one in my family was ever taught the melody." Emily exhaled, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag. "I do not do private work," she said. "I am part of a hospice organization. There are protocols, forms, schedules. I cannot just walk into a stranger's home because you say your family needs it." Michael took another step forward, his tone softening. "I am not asking you to do anything improper. I am asking for an act of kindness." Emily studied him for a long moment. There was something in his eyes that made it difficult to refuse. A man wrapped in the outward signs of control and authority, but at this moment steeped in a sorrow she knew all too well. She recognized that look. She had seen it in dozens of families. Yet in him it did not feel like begging. It simply felt truthful. "One time," she said at last, slowly, "I will come. I will sing. Then I leave." Michael nodded. "Tonight, 8 o'clock. I will send the address." Emily swung the bag over her shoulder. "I will drive myself," she said. "No need to send a car." As she walked past him toward the door, she added softly, "I do not promise any miracles, Mr. Delaney. I only promise to sing. Whatever happens after that is not in my hands." Then she left, and Michael remained alone in the small room, with the unsettling sense that he had just stepped into something far beyond his control. And for the first time in many years, he was not entirely afraid of that. Michael caught up with Emily in the hallway outside the therapy wing, his footsteps echoing steadily across the worn tile floor. She did not stop right away. Only when they neared the main exit did Emily finally turn, her eyes alert but not unkind. The pale light from the ceiling fixture fell across her face, giving her a look that was both steady and tired, as if she had lived through too many similar encounters, most of them ending in disappointment. Michael stopped an arm's length away from her. He was not a man used to talking much, and he was certainly not good at softening the edges of a conversation, but the silence stretching between them forced him to speak. "I am not used to asking strangers for help," he admitted, his voice low and even, "but this time I do not have a choice." Emily folded her arms and leaned lightly against the wall. "I am not refusing to help," she said. "I just do not want to be pulled into something I do not fully understand." Michael nodded. "I understand. My family is complicated." "Laura mentioned a little," Emily replied, "but I do not need the full story. All I really need to know is that your father is dying, and that song might help him." "He used to be the kind of man who never seemed afraid of anything," Michael said, his eyes drifting as if he were no longer talking to her but to some distant part of his own memory. "Now, even in the middle of his fever dreams, he cannot rest. My mother says he keeps trying to remember that song, like it is the last thing he still wants to hold on to." "And you think I can help him keep it?" Emily asked softly. "I think," Michael answered, meeting her gaze, "that you are the only person we have ever heard sing that melody." Emily stayed quiet. She did not want to be drawn into a family that might be coming apart at the seams. She had seen enough people in that kind of pain to know how grief could make them cling to symbols and turn them into something larger than life. But there was something in the way Michael spoke about his father that made her hesitate. There was no romanticizing, no naive hope, only a son trying to do one last thing for the man who raised him. She let out a long breath. "I will come," she said, "but I need you to understand a few things clearly. First, I do not work for private families. Second, I will not take money for this. Third, I will come to sing one time. I am not there to join your family dynamic, and I am not there to perform any miracle of healing. I am not a spiritual healer." Michael nodded, his voice dropping even lower. "One time is all I am asking. Nothing more." Emily loosened her scarf and smoothed the wrinkled fabric, as if grounding herself. "I have appointments until 6 in the evening," she said. "I have to stop by my place to pick up my guitar. 7:30 is the earliest I can be there." 8 o'clock, he replied. "Will that be enough time?" "It will," she said with a small nod. "Address." Michael pulled out his phone, typed a few words, then looked up. "It is the White House at the end of Maple Ridge Street, on the outskirts of Scranton. The house number is on the door, but if you see an old Dodge pickup parked in the driveway, that is my place." Emily frowned slightly. "Scranton. I thought you lived in New York." "I work in New York," Michael said, "but home has always been Scranton." He paused. "My father never left that town." She nodded slowly. A house that never moved. A father who would not let go. A song that had never fully been forgotten. The pieces were beginning to take on a clear shape. Emily turned away, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. But as she passed him, she paused for a heartbeat. "You know," she said quietly, "that song does not stir anything in everyone who hears it. Some people listen and feel nothing." "I know," Michael replied, "but my father is not one of those people." Emily left the facility with her back straight, not hurrying but sure of each step. Michael watched her go, his chest heavy, yet for the first time in many days he felt he had done something right. And perhaps, just perhaps, that night the voice of a stranger would help lead his father back to a place he had lost long ago, a corner of memory that looked like peace. Evening had just settled when Emily drove her old Civic to the end of Maple Ridge Street. Under the soft yellow glow of the street lamp, the White House came into view, simple and unpretentious, with a wide front porch and potted plants lined along the steps, their leaves already withering from the early autumn chill. In the driveway sat a faded Dodge pickup, exactly as Michael had described. Everything about the place felt hushed, as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something about to arrive. Emily turned off the engine and sat still for a few seconds. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, her heart beating steadily but a little harder than usual. She was not afraid, but she did feel as though she was about to step into a space where every word and every sound would linger for a very long time. When she stepped out, Michael was already at the door. He was not wearing a suit this time, but a dark sweater and plain jeans. He looked more approachable, but there was also a denser stillness about him, as if the armor of control he wore every day had slipped a little, revealing something more honest underneath. "Thank you for coming," he said, opening the door for her. "The house is a bit old, but it is warm." Emily gave a small nod and walked inside. The air carried the unmistakable scent of a home that had been lived in for decades. The smell of old wood, a faint hint of stew from the kitchen, and the steady ticking of a wall clock that sounded like a heartbeat. Family photos lined the hallway walls, Michael as a boy, Laura in a frilly princess dress, and a young man in uniform standing beside Ellen in a black and white photograph already turning sepia, a man who could only be James. Michael led her into the living room, where the lights had been turned down to a soft glow. His mother, Ellen, sat beside a hospital bed that had been moved into a corner of the room, her fingers wrapped tightly around her husband's hand. James Delaney lay still, but his eyelids fluttered faintly, as if wrestling inside a dream he could not escape. Emily bowed her head in greeting, then sank to her knees beside the bed. She set her bag down, opened it, and took out a small wooden guitar worn smooth where so many hands had held it. Her fingers brushed the strings and then stilled. "May I sit here?" she asked gently. Ellen nodded, her eyes glistening. "As long as you are close to him." Michael stood a short distance away, leaning against the wall, his hands in his pockets, saying nothing. but his gaze followed Emily's every movement, watching quietly as if trying to make sense of something he could not quite explain. Emily tuned the guitar, then placed her hand softly over James's. His skin felt thin as paper, the blue veins visible in the lamplight. She drew a deep breath, and then she began to sing. Her voice was not loud, not trying to fill the room, but it carried a low warmth, a gentle resonance like wind moving across a field in late afternoon. The song had no words, or if it ever had, they were long gone, leaving only the melody. A southern folk tune, carrying the feel of sun and soil and unnamed memories. For the first time in many days, James stopped moving. His lips no longer trembled with unfinished words. The entire room seemed to fall still, the sound of the machines fading, the ticking of the clock receding, until all that remained was her voice moving through the air like a tide, reaching places no medicine could touch. Michael felt his chest tighten. He could not have explained why, but the sound seemed to soothe more than his father. It loosened something in him as well, something he had buried long ago. Perhaps the picture of a summer afternoon, perhaps the quiet certainty of being safe in the arms of a man he had once believed unbreakable. Emily sang through the second round of the melody, and then let it fade. No one spoke. Ellen began to cry again, but this time no sobs came, only tears sliding down her cheeks, her shoulders trembling gently. James remained silent, yet his hand had relaxed, no longer clenched in the air like it had been in the previous days. Emily set the guitar down on the floor and turned toward Michael. They looked at each other for a long moment. For the first time, they were no longer two people standing on opposite sides of duty and obligation. They were simply two witnesses to something sacred that had just unfolded. Something simple and yet so profound that words could not reach it. "I only sang," she said softly, but perhaps he heard. Michael nodded. His voice was deeper when he answered. "I heard too." Emily smiled, just a little, then bowed her head once more to Ellen. When she rose to leave, Michael stepped closer, his voice dropping to a quiet murmur. "Could you stay a little longer?" Emily lifted her eyes to his. The caution was gone from her expression, replaced by a stillness that felt almost like acceptance. "Just for a little while," she said. And in that moment, both of them understood that they had crossed some delicate boundary between strangers and something more. No one had a name for it yet, but it was already growing between them, quietly, like the melody she had just sung. Emily sat back down beside the bed with the small wooden guitar resting across her lap, her fingers drifting lightly along the strings, as if she were trying to wake something that had been asleep for a very long time. The living room was lit now only by the soft yellow glow of a lamp on the bookshelf in the corner, just enough to reveal the deep lines of age on James's face and the shimmer of tears in Ellen's eyes as she sat on the far side of the bed. Michael remained near the doorway, hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on his father. In that moment, no one spoke. Every ordinary sound seemed to dissolve into the air, leaving only the slight whisper of wind slipping through the narrow opening of the window. Emily closed her eyes, tilted her head just a little, and began to sing. The opening notes were very slow, like hesitant footsteps entering an old house that had not been touched in years. The sound was simple and unadorned, gentle and honest, with no tricks and no ornament, only the true voice of a person singing from a very deep place inside. It was that same old melody again, the nameless song with no clear lyrics, only soft phrases that rose and fell like a whisper from some far-off corner of memory. At first, James did not react. He lay still, eyes tightly shut, his lips dry and motionless. But when she reached the refrain and shifted the key ever so slightly, her voice rising just a little higher, and lighter, like wind moving across open grassland, Ellen suddenly tightened her grip on her husband's hand. "He is," she whispered, her eyes widening. Michael stepped closer, hardly daring to breathe, James's brow furrowed, not from pain, but as if he were listening. His hand curled slightly, and then relaxed. His lips trembled, and then, slowly, a single tear gathered in the corner of his eye and slipped down his cheek to the pillow. Emily did not stop. She sang as though this were the only song she had ever learned, as if no other sound mattered as much as keeping this melody unbroken and whole. She sang with the tenderness of someone who knew loss, with a quiet reverence for a man whose name she had not known until this very day. Ellen began to cry, truly cry this time. She lifted a hand to cover her mouth as tears fell freely, her whole body shaking. Michael stepped forward and laid a hand on his mother's shoulder, but his eyes never left his father. The man who had once stood as a symbol of strength, the man who had been the pillar of the family, lay there now fragile and small, and at last he was able to weep and to feel, and maybe, to let go. When the song came to an end, Emily let the final notes linger and fade into the room. She opened her eyes and gently placed her hand over James's, her palm warm and light, like a wordless farewell. James did not open his eyes, but his face had softened. The deep tension in his brow had eased. His breathing was more even. His whole body seemed to have let go of something heavy that had weighed on him for many years. Ellen squeezed Michael's hand and whispered, "For the first time in 2 weeks, he is at peace." Michael did not answer. His throat was too tight. For the first time in a very long time, he saw his father not as a monument, not as the stern figure pacing the old hallway of this house, but simply as a man trying to find his way home. Emily rose to her feet and carefully slipped the guitar back into its case. She turned to Ellen, her eyes bright but her voice steady. "I do not know if this can happen again," she said. But tonight, he heard. Ellen moved toward her and took Emily's hand in both of her own. No words of thanks were spoken, but in the way she held on, in the look in her eyes, there was a gratitude deeper than any phrase she could have found. Emily turned toward Michael. He nodded, lightly, yet in his gaze there was something new, a quiet softening, the first small crack in the armor he had worn for so many years. "I will walk you to your car," he said. "There is no need," Emily answered softly. "I know the way." She walked away slowly, not in a hurry, as if she wanted to carry the feeling of this house with her just a little longer. When the door closed behind her, Michael remained where he was. Inside the room, James continued to sleep. For the first time in many nights, sleep was no longer a battle. It was simply a stillness, a true rest. And in that stillness, a song had finally found a place to dwell. Michael stayed on the front porch for a long time after Emily had gone. The early autumn wind slipped through the row of maple trees along the street, shaking loose a few yellow leaves that fell softly onto the steps. He was not cold, but an odd sense of emptiness crept into his chest, as if some part of the space inside the house had been carried away with her footsteps. In the living room behind him, everything was calm. The beeping of the heart monitor was steady, yet the sound no longer felt urgent and frightening as it had before. James was sleeping, not struggling, not twisting in distress, just sleeping. Ellen still sat by the bed, her head resting on her husband's arm, eyes closed, her face more peaceful than at any moment Michael had seen in the last 2 weeks. Standing quietly, he pulled out his phone and stared at the blank screen for a long while before typing a message. "Thank you for tonight. My father is at peace. I hope you got home safely." He sent the message and waited, but no reply came. He did not blame her. In her place, he might have been cautious too. Still, something inside him resisted letting this be the end. The next morning he woke earlier than usual. Not for work, not out of obligation, but simply because his father was still sleeping and his mother was at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, staring out through the window. "Is he still calm?" Michael asked. Ellen nodded. "Since that girl left," she said, "he has not mumbled at all. His body has not jerked or tensed. It is as if the song brought him back to where he was meant to be." Michael poured coffee and sat across from her. After a while he spoke, almost as if talking to himself. "I brought in some of the best doctors I could find, specialists in sedation, neurologists. Every one of them said the same thing, that there was nothing left but to wait. And then, with just one song, she did what money could not do." Ellen looked at her son, her eyes filling again. "It was not only the song, Michael," she said gently. "It was her presence. The way she looked at him as if he had never been a frightening man, only a person taking his last steps." Michael said nothing. He had never been good at speaking about feelings, but this morning he did not want to turn away from them. By midday he was behind the wheel, driving toward Queens. The address Laura had given him was on a small side street behind an old church with a copper dome turned green by time. He parked in front of a red brick building and looked up at the second floor, where a window stood slightly open and a white curtain moved softly in the breeze. He had no idea whether Emily was home, but he climbed the stairs and knocked anyway. After a short time the door opened. Emily stood there in a light sweater, her hair tied back, a book still in her hand, not yet closed. She looked surprised but not offended. "You came to see me," she said. "I do not have an appointment," Michael admitted, "and I am sorry for showing up like this. But I needed to say something." Emily stood there quietly, not inviting him in but not closing the door either. Michael went on, his voice calm, without pleading, only honest. "I have never believed in music, not really. For me, everything has always had to be clear, measurable, with concrete results. But last night," he said slowly, "last night you did what no one else could. My father found a little peace. And my mother," she cried like it was the first time in her life over something gentle. Emily closed her book and set it on the small table beside her. "You came to thank me?" she asked. "Partly," Michael said with a nod. "The other part is to ask whether you might come back. Not for a miracle, but for what you brought with you. The stillness, the understanding." Emily studied him for a long moment. She was not looking at his clothes or his posture, but straight into the place inside that men like Michael tried so hard to hide. "I told you it would be only one time," she said. "I know. And you know why I do not take private cases, why I do not go from house to house singing for families. I do." "Then what makes you think anything is different this time?" she asked. Michael let out a breath. "I do not know," he admitted. "I only know that if you agree, my father will hear again the thing he has been straining to remember. And if he goes after that, at least he will carry with him a true sound of his own memory." Emily was silent for a good long while. Then she nodded once, very slightly. "I will come," she said, "but I am still only the one who sings. Do not place your hope on me as if I were someone who could save him. I do not need you to save my father," Michael said, his voice deepening. "I only need someone to lead him home in a way we cannot." Emily gave a small nod. "Tonight, 8 o'clock. Just like before." When she closed the door, Michael turned away, feeling lighter and unsettled at the same time. He did not understand what kind of bond was forming between them, or why this unfamiliar woman made so many things inside him begin to shift. But one thing had become clear. He needed her to come back, not only for his father, but perhaps, in ways he could not yet name, for himself. Emily came every evening at 8 o'clock, just as she had promised. Each time she knocked 3 soft times on the door, then stepped inside with footsteps as quiet as her own singing voice. Michael was usually the one to open the door. He did not say much, only nodded in greeting and stepped aside so she could pass. His mother, Ellen, now regarded Emily as part of the household in her own way, always preparing a cup of ginger tea on the living room table and placing a cushioned armchair beside James's bed. Emily never asked many questions. She simply walked to the bedside, laid her hand on James's thin, frail fingers, and began to sing. The songs she chose were ones no one in the family had ever heard before, yet somehow they seemed strangely familiar to the man lying motionless beneath the blankets. Sometimes her voice soared high like wind sweeping through a valley. Sometimes it sank low and quiet like water lapping against a shoreline far from home. And each time she began to sing, the room seemed to change. The tension in the air dissolved, the hum of the machines grew gentler, and James's breathing slowed and settled. For the first time, on the third night, as Emily was reaching the end of a sorrowful old Italian song, James opened his eyes. He was not fully lucid, but it was clear that he was seeing. Those clouded eyes focused on Emily's face, and his lips moved, though no sound came. Ellen burst into tears, her hands trembling as she gripped his, while Michael stood frozen in the doorway. A moment later, James closed his eyes again, but his expression had changed. It was as if he had just met a fragment of his past he thought had been lost forever. After that night, Emily was no longer simply a visitor. She became something that lived between past and present, between hope and acceptance. Each evening, Michael remained near the doorway. At first, he told himself he was there to keep an eye on things, to help if she needed anything. But as the days passed, he realized he could not stay away from her voice. That voice made his chest tighten with every long-held note and carried his mind into a quiet place he had never allowed himself to enter. He began to notice the smallest things. The way Emily tucked her hair behind her ear after finishing a song, the gentle way she rested a hand on his mother's shoulder before leaving as a wordless farewell, the sadness that flickered in her eyes when she looked at James yet never hardened into pity. One night, after Emily left as usual, Michael walked her all the way to the gate. The air was colder than it had been, the wind cutting sharper, and she shivered slightly. Without speaking, he shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. Emily stopped, looking up at him. In that brief moment, their eyes met in a way that no longer belonged to two strangers forced to trust each other because of a dying man. It was the gaze of two souls beginning to understand the silent language that existed between them. Then Emily turned away, whispered a thank you, and climbed into her car. Michael watched as the vehicle pulled off, the red taillights disappearing beyond the trees, and he could not tell whether the feeling inside him was an emptiness or a fullness made of all the words he had not said. In the nights that followed, James seemed more aware. Once, while Emily was singing Torna a Surriento, he opened his eyes, and for the first time spoke clearly, saying, "She." Her voice is Maria's voice. Ellen almost stopped breathing, and Michael's grip tightened on the doorframe. Emily broke off mid-song, her eyes wide. "You know me?" she asked in a whisper. James did not answer, only smiled the faintest. Smile and closed his eyes again. From that moment on, her presence was no longer an accident or a coincidence. It became part of his final journey. And Michael, though he was not ready to admit it, had begun to look forward to 8 o'clock every evening, not only for his father's sake, but because of the woman whose voice could stir parts of him he had believed had turned to stone. That night, after Emily left as usual, Ellen called Michael to sit with her in the living room. The soft yellow light washed over her tired face, yet the firm lines of a woman who had spent decades in the shadow of power were still clear. Michael held a cup of hot tea, his eyes resting on the fireplace where the logs crackled and burned down to embers. His mother sat in silence for a long time, as if weighing whether she should speak or let the past remain asleep. At last she spoke, her voice gentle, almost like a sigh. "Your grandmother once told me there are songs that can only be sung when a person truly misses home, misses it so deeply that every note makes the heart ache. Your father was never one to show his feelings, you know that. But once, there was a young woman who softened him, and that was the only time in his life I saw him both sing and cry." Michael turned to her, surprised. "You never told me this." Ellen nodded slowly. "Because no one asked," she said. "And because I thought it was over and no one would care. But maybe now it is time." She rose from her chair and went to the old wooden cabinet against the wall, opened a drawer, and took out a small wooden box, worn by years, but carefully kept. Inside were a few faded photographs, a few letters with frayed edges, and a sheet of music stained by time. Ellen took one picture and handed it to Michael. In it, a young man, clearly James in his youth, stood beside a light brown-haired girl whose eyes shone and whose smile was as gentle as spring. "Carter," she said quietly. Her name was Mary Ann Carter. "She met your father in the state of Georgia in the year 1964. He had just left the service, and she was the daughter of a folk musician. They met in a bar where a live band was playing. Your father told me she sang a song he had never heard before, yet he felt as if he had known it by heart from another life." Michael studied the girl in the photo. He could not deny the sense of familiarity. "You are saying that?" Ellen nodded. "Yes, Emily Bennett. Her eyes, the way she smiles, and most of all her voice. It is like seeing the original again. I cannot be certain, but if Mary Ann had a child, and that child then had a child—" Michael sat there stunned. "But how would we know?" he asked. "No one ever talked about her." Ellen lifted one shoulder in a small shrug. "Your father never said much," she replied. "He once planned to stay in Georgia. I know that. Then something happened. I do not know what, only that he came back colder, more closed off. A year later he married me." She paused, her voice growing, softer. "I did not feel jealous, although perhaps I should have. But when I saw his face every time the past came back to him, I understood there were wounds time could not heal. So I chose to love whatever part of him remained." Michael said nothing, his eyes fixed on the photograph in his hand. Ellen took out a letter written in neat blue ink. "This is the last letter Mary Ann sent," she said. "Your father never wrote back, but I kept it. Read it." He took the letter, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded it. The young woman's voice rose from the page with each line, gentle and sincere, filled with regret. She wrote about spring in Georgia, about a new song she had written based on an old melody her grandmother used to sing. Then Michael halted when he reached the final line. If you ever hear this song again someday, she had written, remember that even if we are far apart, a part of my heart is always singing for you, and for the child I never told you about. His grip on the paper tightened. He lifted his eyes to his mother, and now there was more than doubt in his gaze. Something like conviction was starting to form. If this is true, he said slowly, then Emily is Marianne's granddaughter. Ellen nodded. I do not dare claim it as fact, she said, but a mother's heart, my son, does not always need proof. Sometimes it only needs what it feels. Michael leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. That melody, that voice, and now this strange thread tying his dying father to the young woman who had arrived at just the right moment. These things no longer felt like random chance. Everything was beginning to arrange itself like an old piece of music being played again from the beginning, every note and every beat carrying a deeper meaning than ever before. That afternoon, a light rain began to fall, the drops tapping softly against the bedroom window on the second floor, where James Delaney lay still beneath a thin blanket, his breathing as fragile as late autumn mist. The room kept its familiar quiet, filled only with the steady rhythm of the heart monitor and the faint scent of peppermint Ellen often used to soothe the air. Emily arrived earlier than usual. She did not know exactly why, only that she felt a strange pull inside her, an urgency that would not let her wait. She wore a wine-colored sweater, her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, her face free of makeup, yet her eyes were brighter than usual in a way she could not explain. Ellen sat beside James, murmuring something into his ear, while Michael occupied the chair in the corner, a book in his hands that he had not turned a single page of. When Emily stepped into the room, they both looked up, and Ellen gave a small nod. Today he is a little more awake, she said softly. Emily set her bag down and moved quietly to the bedside. She took the hand of the man who had once commanded respect, fear, and admiration from so many throughout his life. Now that hand was little more than skin and bone. Yet for a brief moment he tightened his fingers around hers. Michael leaned forward, his gaze fixed and unblinking. James's eyelids fluttered and then opened, his pupils clouded yet strangely clear. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. "Is that you, child?" he rasped, his voice rough and thin as a passing breeze. Emily leaned closer. "Yes, it is me, Mr. Delaney." James shook his head very slowly. "No," he whispered. "Not Delaney. You do not need to call me that." He blinked and studied her face as though trying to carve every line into his memory. "What is your name?" he asked. Emily Bennett." A faint smile tugged at his mouth. "Bennett," he murmured. Carter Bennett." A tear slipped from the corner of his wrinkled eye. Ellen stepped closer and laid a hand on his shoulder. "James," she said gently, "if there is something you want to say it now. She deserves to hear it." He turned his head toward Ellen with great effort, then looked back at Emily. "Marianne," he whispered. "She looks like Marianne. The eyes, the voice, just like before." Emily hardly dared to breathe. Her body trembled, and she was not sure if it was from emotion or from the weight of some old story rising up from a past she had never known. "You knew her?" she asked quietly. James nodded, tears running freely now. "I loved her," he said. "Once, I thought it would be forever, and then we parted. Mistakes were made. There was no time to make them right. But now, today." His hand lifted, trembling, and touched Emily's cheek, his gaze filled with longing. "You are a daughter," he said. "Not of my blood, but a daughter of memory, of an old song I once forgot. Now I hear it again, and my heart feels at peace." His voice broke. "I am sorry I was not there, that I did nothing. But now I can close my eyes because you have come back and you have sung to me." Emily squeezed his hand, her own tears falling unchecked. Michael remained in his chair, his fingers clamped so tightly around the armrest that his knuckles had turned white. Ellen stepped to Emily's side and bent to kiss her forehead. "Stay with him," she whispered. "We will be here together." James seemed to smile one last time, his lips shaping something so faint that Emily had to lean down to hear it. "I love you, Emily," he breathed, almost no more than a sigh. Then his eyes closed, his hands relaxed, and the green spikes on the heart monitor slowly drew together into a single straight line that stretched across the screen like the lingering echo of one final note. Ellen raised a hand to her mouth, fighting back a soundless cry. Michael stood and came to stand behind Emily, resting his hand on her shoulder. They stood there, the three of them together, watching as an entire life came to its end. There were no wails, no chaos, only a rare stillness in a family that had known so much turmoil and storm. Emily lifted her face, wiped her tears, and whispered a phrase in Old Italian, a small blessing of farewell. Michael watched her for a long moment, and for the first time he saw that death did not only carry loss with it, but also a place where the last knots of a life could finally be untied. James Delaney had left this world in peace, not only because his family stood beside him, but because the woman he had once loved most had returned in the form of a new generation. Her voice, and that song they all thought had been lost, had become a lullaby that carried a man through his regrets and failures, and led him home at last to the quiet house of memory and love. That morning the sky over New York was a solid gray, as if the city itself were observing a moment of silence for a man who had once held a hidden empire within its depths. The funeral of James Delaney was held at St. Augustine Church in Brooklyn, the place that for many years had been chosen by the old world families when they said goodbye to their most important figures. Outside the church, a long line of cars stretched along the faience, curb, black limousines, dark suits, gray ties, black lace dresses, and sunglasses that hid half of every face. Everyone understood this was not an ordinary funeral. Public officials, business leaders, attorneys, ministers, men who owed James a favor or simply did not dare stay away, all were present. The entire neighborhood seemed to fall quiet, with residents watching from a distance, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Emily arrived early and sat in the last pew, wearing a simple black dress and a buttoned wool coat. She brought no flowers and no prepared words, only a heart that had been opened and broken again all within a matter of days. She did not want to draw attention. She only wanted to be present as a small, silent part of something that had reached into her soul more deeply than anything she had known before. At the front of the church, James's photograph rested in a place of honor. It was not an image of him issuing orders with icy authority, nor one of his handsome youth, but a recent picture taken at home, with Ellen and Michael at his side, his eyes dim but warm, his smile soft. The service began with prayer. The priest read the familiar words, but within each person the farewell carried a different sound. To those in the front rows, James was a leader, a builder. To Ellen, he was a husband who had once been cold and distant, yet had finally returned as the gentlest of lovers. To Michael, he was a towering figure he had spent his life both admiring and fearing he might become. And to Emily, he was the first man ever to call her his daughter. When the final hymn began, no one was surprised to hear the melody Emily had once sung by his bedside. The church choir performed it with solemn grace, but something was missing, a softness, a simple honesty that only her voice had given it when it carried James into his last sleep. Michael sat in the front pew with Ellen and Laura, his gaze swept over the crowded sanctuary and finally found the back row where Emily sat alone, her fingers intertwined, her eyes turned toward the altar yet clearly lost in her own thoughts. He rose and walked down the aisle. His footsteps sounded faintly against the stone floor like small cuts through the solemn air. Heads turned as he passed, but he paid them no mind. When he reached her, he stopped. Emily looked up and met his eyes, and her heart clenched. "You should not be sitting back here," Michael said quietly, his voice low enough for her alone. "I only came to say goodbye," she replied. "He was the one who called me his daughter in the end." Michael extended his hand. "You are family," he said. Emily hesitated for a heartbeat, then placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, not like a polite gesture, but as if she had belonged there for a long time already. He led her down the center aisle between the rows of mourners, past hundreds of watching eyes. Some people frowned, others whispered, but no one spoke aloud. No one dared. When Michael Delaney brought someone to sit in the family pew at his father's funeral, there was no need for explanation. The act itself was a declaration. At the front, Ellen looked up at them, her expression free of surprise, filled only with a deep tenderness. She shifted the hem of her dress to make space between herself and Michael. Emily sat down and felt Ellen's hand rest gently on her back, patting her in the quiet, soothing way a mother comforts a child. In that moment, Emily could not hold back her tears, not because she was overwhelmed with grief, but because she had been welcomed. In the midst of a sea of powerful and wealthy people, she, a woman who sang in nursing homes, had been seen, chosen, and accepted as part of something far larger than anything she had dared imagine. When the organ fell silent and the service drew to its close, Michael bowed his head. Ellen lifted a handkerchief to dab at her tears. Emily looked up at James's photograph and whispered, "Thank you for believing in me." And she knew, whether she left after this day or stayed, this moment was real. She had become a part of this family, not through blood but through the simple, enduring truth of the heart. 1 month after the funeral of James Delaney, the large house on the outskirts of Brooklyn sank into a heavy silence. There were no longer the hurried footsteps of staff along the hallway, no longer Ellen's quiet laughter as she made tea for her husband, and no longer the familiar dry cough from James's bedroom on the second floor. Everything had become so still that Michael could hardly breathe each time he stepped through the front door. Outside, the late autumn wind blew hard, bringing cold rain and a chill that seemed to seep all the way into the bone. For 30 days, Michael had officially taken on all the responsibilities his father left behind. Meetings, private gatherings behind closed doors, phone calls in the middle of the night from people he could not refuse. It all crashed over him like a wave without end, pulling him away from sleep, from his meals, from anything that might have belonged to him alone. The way people looked at him had changed. They no longer saw a son, they saw a boss, a successor, a name to fear or to depend on. But what exhausted him most was not the deals or the invitations. It was the feeling that he was slowly becoming exactly what his father had been, strong and decisive, but so cold that he was utterly alone. That night, after a meeting that lasted nearly 3 hours in his father's old study, Michael drove to a neighborhood in Queens. No driver, no bodyguards. He parked in front of a 3-story red brick building, turned off the engine, and sat for a long moment, his fingers tapping softly on the steering wheel as if weighing whether to knock on the door or turn back. In the end, he stepped out, his heavy coat not quite enough to keep out the biting cold. He climbed the stairs and stopped at the door of apartment number 3. He had not called ahead. He had sent no message. He had simply come, as though something inside him insisted that if he did not see her now, he might forget who he was. Emily opened the door after 2 knocks. She wore a soft gray sweater, her hair tied back, her face bare of makeup. When she saw Michael, her eyes did not flash with surprise, only with a gentle pause at the unexpected sight of him standing there. "You are late," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. "You had no appointment," he replied. The apartment was small but warm, the golden glow from a table lamp softening the room and making it easier to breathe. Michael sat on a fabric-covered chair by the window, his eyes unable to hide how tired he was. "For the past month," he began, "I have not had a single second to ask myself what I am doing." "And now?" Emily asked, pouring 2 cups of hot tea and setting one in front of him. "Now I am starting to feel afraid," he admitted, his voice dropping. "Not afraid of the work, afraid of myself, afraid that one day I will wake up and find I have become exactly like my father, decisive but empty, with everything and yet with no one." Emily sat across from him, listening in silence. "You are not like him," she said after a while. "You feel things, you think, you hesitate. You want to do what is right, not only what is effective." Michael lifted his gaze to her. "I only feel this way when I am with you," he said. "When I hear you sing, when I see you sitting in the kitchen with my mother, when you walked into the funeral and I realized that without you, I would never know what peace feels like." "Michael," Emily replied slowly, "I cannot be your salvation. I am not the one who can mend every empty place inside you." "I know," he said with a small, bitter smile. "I did not come here to ask you to fix anything. I just need to be here, even if only for a little while." Emily moved to sit beside him, saying nothing, letting him rest his head against her shoulder. She felt his breathing slow, as though, after many days of struggling, he had finally allowed himself to be vulnerable. "Do not forget," she whispered, "in all the cruelty of this world, you still have the right to choose, to be soft, to be true, to love." Michael took her hand and held it tightly. For the first time in weeks he felt warm, not because of the room or the tea, but because she was there. She did not try to comfort him with promises or offer strategies like an advisor. She simply stayed, steady and quiet, like a short piece of music that is long enough to remind someone of who they really are. And Michael knew he would come back, not only once. The pale winter morning light slipped in through the edge of the kitchen window, falling across Emily's quiet face as she sat at the table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. The apartment still carried the scent of cinnamon from the small cake she had baked the night before. Michael sat opposite her, equally thoughtful, his fingers intertwined on the dark wooden tabletop, his eyes never leaving her face. The previous night they had sat side by side for a long time without needing to speak. But this morning the silence felt different, heavier, as if what was about to be said would turn the course of everything. Emily set her cup down and looked up, her gaze calm but not entirely free of confusion. "Yesterday I got a call from Portland," she began. "A care home for the elderly wants me to come work as the artistic director for their music therapy program. A long-term job, steady pay, housing included. They heard a recording of a song I sang here, through a friend." Michael did not look surprised. He nodded slightly, as though he had known this would come. "Will you go?" he asked. Emily held his gaze for a long moment, then shook her head. "I have thought about it a great deal. A year ago I would not have hesitated. It is the kind of job I used to dream of, safe and decent and clear. But now, I am not so sure." "Why?" he asked, his voice low and measured. "Because that place does not have your mother," she said. "It does not have the sound of your footsteps coming down to the kitchen in the middle of the night because you cannot sleep. It does not have James. It does not have our memories. And it does not have you." Michael's hands tightened slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I cannot give you a peaceful life," he said quietly. "I cannot promise what tomorrow will look like. Everything around me is the kind of thing that can swallow people whole if they are not careful." "I know," Emily answered, "but peace is not the only thing I am looking for. I have sung for people who had stopped expecting anything from the world, just so they could brush against their memories one last time. But you and your family gave me something I had never had before, a place to stay, not just another place to pass through." Michael bowed his head, his voice catching. "I never thought I could love anyone the way my father once loved," he said. "But when I saw you walk into the church that day, and then turn as if you were going to slip away like an outsider, I realized that if I let you walk out of my life again, there would be nothing left strong enough to hold me to whatever is human inside me." Emily stood, crossed the small space between them, and laid a hand on his shoulder. "I am not leaving," she said. "Not because you need me, but because I want to stay. No matter what the future looks like, I am choosing here. I am choosing you." Michael looked up, and in his eyes there was not only fatigue now, but something that looked like hope. He rose to his feet and took her hand, squeezing it gently, the way his father had once held Ellen's hand when she chose to walk beside him, even knowing the road ahead would not be smooth. "I cannot promise you anything," he whispered, "but I will not let you regret staying." Outside the window, the first snow began to fall, soft white flakes drifting down, onto the rooftops, settling on each window ledge and branch. The small kitchen grew warmer with the quiet presence of two people who did not need many words to understand that sometimes choosing to stay with someone is not about duty or logic, but simply because the heart cannot turn away. And no matter how many offers and opportunities waited beyond that city and beyond that winter, Emily had chosen the thing that made her feel most like herself. She had chosen Michael. She had chosen a home, a memory, and a song whose final verse had yet to be sung. That afternoon the sky had turned a pale gray, with quiet clouds drifting overhead, as though they too were in mourning for something that could not be named. The cemetery on the outskirts of the city was so still that one could hear the wind brushing across the brittle grass and the last fallen leaves of late autumn. Michael walked slowly between the straight rows of headstones, dressed in a dark, impeccably fitted suit that carried no trace of extravagance. In his hand was a small velvet box, the same one he had been holding all morning without yet finding the courage to open it. Emily walked beside him, her long beige coat following the slight curve of her frame, her blue eyes calm and steady with a quiet strength. They said nothing through the entire walk from the parking lot to the place where James Delaney now rested. Before the stone etched with his father's name, Michael stopped and bowed his head, as though he were still half expecting to hear that familiar voice again. Emily took a step back to give him space, but Michael turned toward her, took her hand, and drew her closer. "I come here often," he said softly, "not because I have not let go, but because whenever I lose my direction, I want to hear his voice in my head again, reminding me of who I am." Emily squeezed his hand gently. "You are still the man he was proud of," she whispered. Michael was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the carved stone. Then he turned to her, his gaze filled with something he had never spoken aloud. "There was something my father said before he died, back when he was still lucid enough to recognize you," Michael began. "He told me not to let myself grow so hardened that I forgot how to be gentle. He said that if anyone ever made me remember that I was human before I was a successor, I should hold on to that person." Emily did not respond. She simply waited. Michael drew a deep breath and opened the velvet box in his hand. Inside was a simple ring of white gold, set with a small emerald at its center, surrounded by tiny diamonds that glimmered like morning dew. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, his voice low and weighted with the history of generations. "Then my mother kept it, and now she has given it back to me. I know my world is not an easy one to step into, and love alone cannot protect you from all that might happen. But I do not want to watch you drift through my life like a gentle breeze. I want you to stay, not just as the woman who helped my father find peace, but as the woman who will walk beside me from this day forward. Emily Carter, will you marry me?" Emily looked at the ring, then lifted her eyes to him. There were no tears, no dramatic gasps, only a slow, steady nod. "I know you are dangerous," she said softly. "I know your world will not accept me easily. There will be those who oppose this, those who may try to use me to hurt you. But I also know I have never wanted to stand beside anyone the way I want to stand beside you. So, yes, I will." Michael exhaled, as though something heavy on his chest finally released its hold. His hand trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger. When the band settled against Emily's skin, it felt not only fitting but like a promise that had been waiting in their blood for a very long time. He pulled her into his arms, and in the stillness around them, the only sounds were their heartbeats and the wind moving through the branches overhead. Far away, the sun dipped low, washing the gray sky with a faint orange hue like a quiet breath of hope. "We will have to face many things," Michael murmured against her hair. "I know," Emily answered, "and I still choose you." They remained there for a long time, and then together they turned away from the grave of James Delaney. But it was not a departure, it was a beginning. In the cold quiet of the cemetery, a place meant for endings, they had found a promise large enough to open an entire lifetime. The next morning the air was cool but dry, with no rain and no harsh wind like the days before. It was a stillness so clear and gentle that it felt as though the city of New York itself had paused for a moment to witness something sacred and private. The wedding of Michael Delaney and Emily Bennett was held in the backyard, the same place where James had spent long hours each evening watching the leaves change with the seasons. There were no trumpets or crowds, no reporters, no lavish pageantry. Only family, a few trusted relatives, several longtime staff members, and a handful of friends Michael truly believed in. Ellen had prepared everything herself, from the lace tablecloth draped over a small wooden table to the simple floral arrangement placed beside her old wedding photograph with James. She wanted her son's wedding to be nothing like the extravagant ceremonies their family had been known for. She wanted this day to reflect the kind of love that had been forgotten in her husband's life and was now being written anew in the lives of the next generation. Emily wore a pale cream dress, simple and elegant, holding a small bouquet of white tulips. Her hair was swept back loosely, with a few soft strands falling naturally along her cheeks. When she stepped out of the house, the yard fell silent. No one spoke, but every eye brightened with a mixture of surprise and quiet emotion at the gentle beauty she carried. Michael stood beneath a small wooden archway, his gray suit pressed and understated, a tiny flower pinned to his lapel. His eyes never left her, not even for a breath. When their eyes met halfway across the yard, time seemed to pause. Every storm, every question, every unspoken fear that had followed them for months dissolved into a single certainty. They belonged to each other. The ceremony took place beneath climbing vines threaded with strands of small golden lights, between rows of wooden chairs filled with familiar faces. Laura presided over the wedding. There was no minister, no heavy religious ritual. She simply told the story of a love that began with a song, with a dying father, and with a woman who stepped into their lives at the precise moment they needed her most. When it came time for vows, Michael turned to Emily, his gaze deep and unwavering. "I have lived too long in a world where everything can be bought, negotiated, or controlled," he said. "But you are the one thing I cannot control, and I do not want to." You are the choice my heart makes again and again. And from today on, I want to spend my life writing the rest of the unfinished songs with you." Emily smiled softly, her eyes shimmering. "I once thought my life would be nothing but the quiet hallways of nursing homes, singing songs for people who were fading away, with no one remembering me when they were gone. But you made me believe that my voice is not only for healing the past, but for building a future. I cannot promise that everything will be easy, but I promise I will be here, with you." As they exchanged rings, Ellen rose from her seat holding a small, time-worn velvet box. She stepped forward and stopped before Emily, her expression both solemn and tender. "This necklace was worn by Michael's grandmother on her wedding day," she said. "She passed it to her daughter, who later passed it to me. And now I want you to have it. Not because you need to prove anything to anyone in this family, but because you are already part of us in every way that matters, even without blood." Emily opened the box, revealing a delicate gold chain with a tiny green stone that shimmered softly under the morning light. Her hands trembled as Ellen fastened it around her neck, then embraced her for a long time. No words were needed in that moment, because everyone understood. Emily Bennett was no longer an outsider, stepping into the world of the Delaneys. She had become an essential part of everything the family now stood for: rebirth after loss, courage in the face of shadows, and a love that asked for nothing but truth. When the ceremony ended, the guests applauded gently while Michael took Emily's hand and led her into their first dance in the small yard, where an old song drifted through the air like a tender whisper. Above them, the golden lights twinkled like falling stars, wrapping them in a moment that belonged entirely to them. And in that soft glow, Emily began to hum along with the music, her voice as light as breath and as warm as memory. The song that had once awakened a fading heart was now being sung as a quiet triumph, a love that began in farewell and ended in belonging. That afternoon, after the warm wedding held beneath the sunlit canopy of vines, everyone gathered around for the small reception that Ellen had arranged almost entirely with her own hands. The Delaney backyard had never felt so alive. Round tables draped in white cloth were set in a loose circle, leaving a space in the middle for a makeshift stage. Strings of lights hung overhead like an artificial sky, glowing in gentle waves as the day softened into evening. Laughter drifted through the air, glasses clinked with toasts full of blessing, and soft jazz floated out from an old speaker resting on a side table by the porch. No one talked about business, and no one mentioned the Delaney name as a symbol of power. On this evening, they were only relatives and friends of a family, celebrating love and the beginning of a new chapter written with tenderness and trust. Emily sat among a group of older men and women, people who had been advisors, comrades, or longtime staff in Michael's world. They told her stories of James in his youth, tales that had never appeared in files or in the papers, stories of how he would disappear for a few days just to track down an old song his mother once sang to him. Emily smiled and listened, sometimes adding a small comment that made everyone burst into laughter. She was no longer a stranger. She was no longer that quiet guest sitting at the edge of conversations like someone hovering outside the circle. Now she was Emily Delaney, the daughter-in-law everyone agreed had brought light back into a house that had lived in shadows for far too long. Michael sat not far away, watching her with a gaze that was gentle and at ease. He had never imagined that the woman he loved would blend into his world so naturally and completely. She did not have to posture or play a role. She only had to be herself, with her laughter, her eyes, and the warmth of her presence. As night finally settled in, Ellen stood and tapped lightly against her wineglass. "Today," she said, her voice clear but thick with emotion, "we are not only celebrating Michael and Emily, we are celebrating this family. Because for the first time in many years, there is music again, and laughter, and real life in this house." She turned to Emily, her eyes shining. "You brought us something none of us even knew we were missing. Thank you, Emily." There was a round of applause, and Emily could only bow her head in gratitude, unable to hide the emotion rising in her chest. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice called out gently, "Sing for us, Emily, sing for us again." She hesitated at first, but when Michael took her hand and led her to the open space at the center of the tables, she did not refuse. There was no microphone, no backing band, only her and the hush that settled over the gathering like a waiting stage. Emily drew a deep breath and began to sing. This time it was not the sorrowful song she had once sung at James's bedside. She chose instead a joyful, old country tune, the kind Marianne used to sing when she was young. Her voice rang out clear and bright, full of life, like the last shaft of sunlight breaking through a bank of clouds. When the song ended, the guests did not just clap. Some rose to their feet, some joined in a dance, others hummed the melody under their breath. The reception ceased to be a wedding party alone, and became a reunion of souls that had once grown hard and were now softening in the glow of a genuine love. Emily spun through familiar arms, through music and embraces, knowing she had found a home, not just a roof, but a place where her heart could finally rest. Michael held her hand all evening and never once let go, as though a part of him still feared she might vanish if he loosened his grip, but she did not. This was real. She was here, with him. And in that moment, surrounded by laughter and song and handshakes and looks of acceptance, Emily blended into the crowd not as someone newly arrived, but as someone who had always belonged there and was only now being called by her true name. The next morning, the Delaney kitchen was filled with the scent of flour, eggs, and fresh basil. The first light of day poured through the large window, falling across the long wooden table where Ellen and Emily stood side by side, working dough for pasta. There were no parties now, no echo of last night's noisy celebration. Only two women, two generations, two very different roles now bound together by an invisible but powerful thread called family. Ellen wore a beige apron, rolling the dough carefully in long strokes, her eyes following each cut Emily made. She said nothing for a while, simply watched, then nodded slightly, as if to acknowledge that her new daughter-in-law was learning quickly. Emily, her hair pulled up, sleeves rolled past her elbows, her hands dusted in white flour, laughed softly as Ellen corrected a crooked strip of dough. "I am not sure I will ever be as good as you," she said, half joking and half honest. "These first noodles look more like old ribbon scraps than anything we should eat." Ellen smiled, her gaze gentle, her natural sharpness softened but still present beneath the surface. "Everyone starts with old ribbon scraps," she replied, "even me. The first time I tried, James took one look and said they looked like worn-out shoelaces. I was angry with him for a whole day." Emily laughed. Then her smile softened when she realized Ellen's voice no longer broke when she mentioned James. This was peace after the storm, a place where grief had calmed and memory had become a companion instead of a ghost. They worked in silence for a few more minutes. Then Ellen set the rolling pin down, wiped her hands on a towel, and turned to Emily. "Are you afraid?" she asked, her voice low and sincere. Emily paused, knife still in her hand, and looked up. Afraid of what? Of becoming part of this family, of standing at Michael's side in the middle of everything he represents. Power, expectations, history, and all the burdens that not everyone would choose to share. Emily drew a breath, her gaze drifting toward the window that looked out over the garden. "Of course," she said softly. "I have been afraid of many things, afraid I would not be enough, that I would not fit, afraid that my past is too small to stand beside a name that carries so much weight. But more than any of that, I was afraid of letting Michael pass through my life and not holding on to him at all." Ellen said nothing at first. She eased herself into a nearby wooden chair. "I was once the only woman in a world of men," she said quietly. "Every step I took, I had to hold on, not just as a wife, but as the one who kept the fire burning in our home. There were times I felt exhausted and lost, but I came to understand that women, like us, are often the true backbone of whatever endures." Emily put the knife down, wiped her hands clean, and took a seat across from her. "I am not sure I can be as strong as you," she admitted. "You do not need to be like me," Ellen said, her eyes glinting with warmth. "You only need to be yourself. Emily, you stepped into James's life at a moment when no one else could have done what you did. Not through power, not through connections, but through something simpler and greater than those things, the honesty in your voice and in your heart. That is not something anyone can teach, and it cannot be copied." Emily ducked her head, hiding a small, moved smile. Ellen rose from her chair, came around the table, and rested a hand on her shoulder, offering not only acceptance but a share of the unseen legacy carried by the Delaney women. "This family needs someone like you," she said, "not because you sing beautifully, but because you are sincere enough to heal and brave enough to stay." Outside, the breeze lifted a few loose strands of hair at Emily's forehead. In the kitchen, flour dusted the table, and the rich smell of tomato sauce began to drift through the air. In that simple, ordinary moment, Emily understood that sometimes being trusted matters more than any grand declaration, and that day she was not only learning how to make pasta, she was being seen. She was being recognized as the woman worthy of carrying forward a flame that had once nearly gone out and was now burning bright again in the hearts of those who remained. That late afternoon, Michael and Emily walked together through the small park along the Hudson River, a place they had often visited whenever they needed a fragment of peace in the restless pulse of the city. The trees had begun to shed their leaves, covering the ground in shades of red and gold, and the last light of day stretched itself across the winding stone path like a soft woven carpet. They did not hold hands as they usually did, but walked, side by side, step by step, silent and at ease. Emily wore a light brown wool coat, a knitted scarf wrapped around her neck, her hair loosely tied at the back. She watched a group of children chasing one another near the fountain, then turned to look at Michael with quiet thoughtfulness. "Michael," she asked after a long silence, "after your father passed, what changed?" Michael did not answer immediately. He unbuttoned the top of his shirt collar as though needing more room to breathe in the cool autumn air. "Everything," he said, his voice low. "You lose one person, but somehow an entire world disappears with them." Emily listened, waiting. Michael paused by a long wooden bench and sat down, his eyes drifting toward the shimmering river. "When he was alive, even without saying it, I always felt there was a shield in front of me, something that protected me, a wall that took the impact. Everything I did fell under his shadow, including my mistakes. But when he was gone, all the weight fell onto me at once, and there was no one left to lift even a piece of it." He gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "I thought I was ready. I spent my whole life preparing to take over. But no one teaches you how it feels to stand alone in the storm without anyone to call and ask, 'What do I do now?'" Emily sat beside him, her eyes soft and steady. "And you were afraid?" Michael nodded. "I was afraid of failing, afraid of hurting people, afraid of becoming the worst version of myself. There were nights I couldn't sleep, wondering whether I was guiding this family the right way or simply repeating the mistakes of the past." Emily touched his hand lightly. "And then I remembered what he said in those final days. That strength alone doesn't make you worthy of leading anything. It is your willingness to face the truth, even when it isn't what you want to see." Michael lifted his gaze to hers, the sorrow in his brown eyes mingling with a new clarity. "I am not perfect. I carry his good and his bad. But I have you. And with you, I learned how to admit fear and keep walking anyway, instead of pretending I was unshakable." Emily smiled gently. "I used to think fear was something we had to conquer, something we had to outrun. But I have realized fear is often what makes us human. It humbles us, and it reminds us to hold tight to what matters most." Michael took her hand and squeezed it. "What matters to me is you." They sat there, the sunlight fading behind the tall buildings across the river, the wind brushing past with the scent of grass, dry leaves, and memory. Emily rested her head on his shoulder. "I never asked what would come after all of this," she whispered, "because I was afraid the answer might change what we have now." "Then do not ask," Michael murmured. "We do not need to know everything. We only need to know that today we choose each other, and tomorrow we want the same." Somewhere along the path, a child laughed loudly, breaking the stillness, and a pair of pigeons fluttered, down to pick at breadcrumbs on the grass. Life continued gentle, steady, unhurried. Just like their love, born from an old song and a dying man, kept alive through every choice, every conversation, every quiet step taken together on a difficult road. And in that moment, beneath the soft retreat of light, Michael understood he was no longer alone, no longer the sole bearer of a heavy legacy. He had Emily, not as a crutch, but as a true companion. 1 month later, the Delaney home felt strangely peaceful. No more chaos, no more painful silences. Only a new rhythm forming itself slowly, like a melody carried forward from an unfinished verse. Emily did not leave. She did not take the offer in Portland, nor return to the familiar hallways of the nursing home. She stayed. Every morning she went to the market with Ellen. Every afternoon she brewed tea with Michael. And every evening she played the piano in the living room where James once rested, singing old songs for a memory that had settled but never faded. The days passed slowly, gently, without a single dull moment. They learned to listen more, learned to forgive, and learned how to begin again without erasing the past. Michael shed that hard exterior he once wore like armor, and allowed himself to be more open, more honest. A man learning how to be a husband, a son, and one day perhaps a father. Emily was no longer the girl who had stepped into their lives like a miracle, but someone woven into their very blood and bone. One quiet evening, with no celebration and no occasion, Michael unexpectedly turned off all the lights in the living room, leaving only a row of candles glowing along the windowsill and an old lampshade Ellen had brought down from the attic. Emily walked in, startled, and before she could ask, he extended his hand. He said nothing. He simply nodded. She understood. She placed her hand in his, and they began to dance in the dimness of the room, a room that had held so much pain and so much rebirth. As the slow melody drifted from the old speaker, Emily began to sing. No orchestra, no grand arrangement, only her voice, honest and unadorned. It was the same old song that had softened James's heart in his final days, but now it was sung by the daughter-in-law he had claimed as his own before closing his eyes forever. Her voice was not perfect, but it was so true that everything in the room seemed to fall quiet just to hear it. Michael closed his eyes and rested his forehead against hers, and in that moment they needed no vows, no rituals, no audience. They needed only one another. And so, from 1 month of trying, they stepped into a life that would last. Their story did not begin with roses or a confession. It began with a forgotten note from the past, found by someone brave enough to listen and someone generous enough to let it return. And dear friend, if you have stayed with this story until the very last second of this video, perhaps something in your own heart has been touched, maybe a trace of longing, a spark of hope, or simply the quiet wish to be loved and understood the way Michael and Emily found each other. So tell us, what did this story stir in you? Did it remind you of someone who once changed your world in ways you never expected? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Every word you leave there is a source of inspiration that helps us continue bringing stories that touch the soul, soothe old wounds, and kindle hope in this uncertain life. And do not forget to subscribe, like, and share this video if it meant something to you. We will keep telling you heartfelt, meaningful stories every day. Until the next video, where another song, another life, may remind you of your own, wishing you a peaceful day, good health, and a heart warmed always by true and gentle love. Goodbye for now, and see you soon.